Hello, I thought I'd make a video to talk a little bit about interpreting exam scores and calculating your grade in the class and maybe projecting where we might be heading towards in terms of final grades in this class. Okay, so I get this question a lot, how do we assign letter grades? We truly only assign a letter grade at the very end of the semester. In fact, I would almost not worry so much about what your given letter grade on a particular assignment is, because your performance on all the assignments is really what determines your final grade. So I would recommend putting more emphasis and focus on how you're going to get a better midterm 2 score than trying to figure out exactly what your grade might be on midterm 1. But, at the same time, I do understand that people, that you guys would really like to understand where you stand in the class at this moment. So let's go through a little bit of information. And what I'd like to try to do is explain how it is that we actually set letter grades and how it is that we determine where the grade cuts happen to fall. Now, grades are described on page 5 of the syllabus. There's about 2/3 of a page on this discussion. I'm going to summarize a little bit of that information here. What we do is we take a look at this average grade, and we would do this at the end of the class with the total, score in the class, with the total average in mind. So our average across all students on midterm 1 was 76%. Now let's imagine at the end of the semester our average grade is a 76%. Now what that would do is it would set the grade somewhere in the C range. Historically in Chem 1210, it's usually in the range of about C+. Now what that means is that as long as the performance on exams is where we generally expect it to fall, and I would say generally midterm 1 went pretty well, that as long as you guys are performing where we expect you to, or maybe even a little better, then this grade would be higher in the C range, or maybe even higher if the performance were to, say, exceed our expectations by a fair bit more on midterm 2, midterm 3, and the final. Okay, so right now I'd say if we're setting grades, we're probably going to set the average in the class to be about a C+. Okay, what that means is, or the next thing we would look at is kind of where the top in the class ends up being. Not necessarily the highest grade, but when you're breaking down the 90 to 100% range, where do you kind of start to see the drop off and not see very many students at all? Like if you're thinking in terms of your curve, it'd be looking and seeing kind of like where do you get this drop off here, and cutting that off as your top. Right now, I'd say that's probably in the range of about, 96% to 97% for this exam. Let's say it's 96%. Okay, so if we take the top score minus the average score, that's a 20% range. That's the 20% range that we have to assign the grades of C+, B-, B, B+, A-, and A. And so then if you think of the score that you would need on these exams to get that grade, we take the fact that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 grades in this range, and then that would be divided into 20. I think that works out to be about 3.3%. And so that would set our grade here to be about 76% to get the C+. And I wouldn't worry so much about the specific cuts right now. Everybody gets all worked up on where the actual cuts are at this point in the class, but this would be about 79.3, just adding that 3.3 to each one of those scores. And I'm just throwing this into a calculator right now. So it would be 82.6 roughly for a B. It'd be roughly 85.9 for the B+, 89.2 for an A-, and then 92.5 for an A. Now again, I'm not saying this is your grade right now per se. I'm saying if the average in the class is a 76 at the end of the semester and the top end of the class is around a 96, then these would roughly be where our grade cuts would fall. Now, like I said, if the exam performance is better, then sometimes, the minimum score you would need for these grades could be lowered a little bit. So we could lower these if the performance in the class seems to dictate it, or the performance across all the Chem 1210 sections. So we're not locked in to setting these grades per se, or not improving them from where you see them here. So it's possible the grades could be slightly better, and if the performance goes the other way, it could be worse too. But I think every indicator I can see in the class is that you guys are working really hard, you're trying your best, almost across the board. So I really like the performance that I'm seeing in the class, and the type of questions you guys ask in lecture, the type of emails I get are great. So I think you guys as a whole are doing very well and just need to continue that performance. And towards the end of this little video here, we're going to go into a couple of study habit suggestions for maybe trying to improve that performance. Okay, now likewise, how do we set the grades in the bottom end of the grade scale? Because obviously we have to set the other grades for like the C range, the C minus range, the D plus range, the D range, and then the E range. There actually is no D minus at Ohio State. So the way these grades would kind of work is we would take generally about a 50 or a 55%, depending on the class, as the lowest grade we're going to take for a passing grade. If for some reason our final average of the class was in like the 60 to 70% range, we might lower that a little bit. But I would take this line here, the minimum grade you're going to need to get at least a D, to be about 55%. And if you have less than that, then that's going to be into the E range. And so then from 55 up to, in this case, 76, that difference, I'm just throwing that into a calculator, is 21%. So like our 4 grades on the bottom end of the class have a 21% spread. And so that means there'll be about 5.25% in between each of these grades. And so that means the minimum for a D plus would probably be about 60.25%. The minimum for a C minus ends up being about 65.5. And the minimum for the C plus, or the C solid grade, would be about 70.75. Add another 5.25 to that, and you get to the C plus range of 76. Okay, so this is about typical. That in my last year class, I did look this up. The minimum for a C minus at the end of the semester was right around a 65 to a 66%. So it tends to work out that the lower grades get a little bit more of a, maybe you might call it a curve. I don't know what we call this process. This is like grading on a bell curve. So they might get a little bit more of a generous a curve if you compare the grade that you're getting here to a normal grade scale, whereas the top end grades usually tend to fall more closer in line with the grades you would tend to expect. Now, if our averages go a lot lower, then you're going to see the scores improve for the scores it takes to get an A or an A minus or a B plus. But something, that becomes tricky to understand is like, how do you beat the curve? Like half the class by definition is probably going to be on the bottom half of the curve. The other half will be on the positive half of the curve. Well, I think just getting that performance up so that we can see the performance is better than in past years. We use a lot of questions that we know what the scores should generally be so that the performance is higher, we'll notice. And if it's higher by a substantial amount, then we could curve the class to a B minus if the right situation dictated that we do that. We could also curve the class around a B if the performance is really a lot better. So I think, we're never going to have a case where, there's always going to be a half below the average, half above the average, because that's how numbers work. But I think the best thing that you can do is try to get your score into that 80 to 90% range on exams. And then if the average happens to be very high, then that's going to be the case where the class is doing much better on whole than in the past. Our exam averages run the gamut. Usually midterm 1's the highest. The concepts are probably the easiest, as you'll see as we continue in the class. But midterm 2 and 3 usually aren't tremendously low. Usually they're in the range of about 70%. So towards the end of this video, I will come back to some propagations of where you might expect the final average in the course to end up, but it's probably going to be in the range of about 75%, give or take a couple percent. So I think, people always want to know if there's going to be a curve, and I would say, the better question is just how can you get a 3% better grade on the test and have that be your curve. That's going to be a much easier way to control your final grade, is just trying to eke out that little bit of performance. And it really is going to come from, I think, just having a little bit more efficiency with studying. Not necessarily studying more, but just trying to find ways to study a little bit better in the class. All right, so let's talk about calculating homework score. The gradebook in Carmen is really screwy. I wouldn't look at your homework score in Carmen and base a whole lot there. There's a few errors, like For example, the only required points you need to earn are the points available on pre-lecture assignments, the PLAs, and the PSs, the problem sets. If you look in the Carmen gradebook, it would seem as if the dynamic study modules, the chemistry, I forget what they're called, the key concepts of chemistry questions, it seems as if those are worth points if you look in the Carmen gradebook, but if you look in the Mastering gradebook, that's not the case. So you got to go to the Mastering gradebook is probably the best place to actually try to look for your total score. You can add them up too, but the thing you want to do is add up all the points you've earned on all of the assignments and take note of that number. Right now, if you add up the points on all the required assignments from the pre-lecture assignments and the problem sets, this is 198 points through this Sunday. That's through problem set 10. Okay, so if you haven't done problem set 10, then you haven't had a chance to earn the final 10 or so points towards that 198. But go look and see what your total is and see how many of those 198 points that you've earned so far. My quick looking says that about 2/3 of the class has that score or better. Now, the maximum score is 100%, but the point of the homework is for you to learn and to do have a wide variety of types of problems, types of homework sets, so that everybody hopefully has a set of problems that they can find and do and learn from and prepare for the exams. So yeah, there's a lot of problem sets available. Some of them are extra credit, some of them are required. The points are really what are required. The points from those assignments, no matter how you get that 198, you can get it a variety of ways. But approach the homework in terms of your learning. Try to approach the homework not as points you need to earn, but as the way or a blueprint for you to actually go through the learning that you need to go through. The daily extra assignments, for some of you guys, may be the best assignments to do. So you might look at those and do more of those and then sacrifice some points on other assignments along the way. If you don't find some of the pre-lecture tutorials to be very good, then you don't need to earn the points there if you're going to earn them on some extra credit assignment. So you can pick and choose a little bit. I think you still need to do at least some of the pre-lecture assignments and some of the problem sets, but maybe you'll skip a few problems here and there. Maybe you don't have to focus on just figuring out what the answer is. Instead, try to learn how to approach the problem. How can you take what you know and apply it to solve the problem? So my recommendation is, do the problem sets, close book. You don't have to, but close that book. Get good at solving problems without the book or notes or help available. And have the idea in the back of your mind that if you can't do the problems without getting some help, then you probably just need to do a little more reading, a little more lecture video watching. Work through some of the sample and practice exercises in the textbook. The pre-lecture assignments, I think these are designed to have have your book opened. So again, like I said, you can open your book during the problem sets. I just think that you're not giving yourself a chance to apply what you're learning to make sure that you learn the content and that you're able to apply it. So if you got to midterm 1 and you were a bit flustered, you had a hard time remembering some of the things you thought you were going to remember, it's probably this thing here, closing that book for the problem sets. Then I think the daily extras, I don't know, it's up to you. I have no specific recommendation on those. I would probably try to close the book when you can, and then just read and try to interpret more information if you need to. Like if you're stuck on a problem on a daily extra, I would probably go review the entire topic as needed. So, review, and do extra problems, probably close book. And then lastly, I would say those dynamic study modules, close the book for those as well. Those are kind of like a quiz. Those are almost perfectly taken if you keep your books closed. So I think that's like a really important idea that's really hard to do sometimes because, you only get the points and you don't want to have to do these extra assignments, but just close the book, test yourself, quiz yourself. One of the things with the daily extras for chapters like 4, 5, and 6 that I did, a little bit unlike some of the other chapters. If you look at the assignment that will be due like this coming Monday on the daily extra, it's kind of like a quiz. It's probably not exactly the most cumulative quiz per se, but it's a variety of problems I could find that are multiple choice based. So, and it's relatively short, it'll probably take you 10 or 20 minutes to do that and earn, a couple extra bonus points. And then the same thing the following Monday. So right now I'm going to work it out that on Mondays, the daily extras will be kind of like wrapping up a chapter with a short quiz. And then Tuesday we'll just restart the next chapter. So this week we just had, this past week here, was all, chapter 4 daily extra problems, and then Mondays we'll wrap it up with the short quiz. Next week's daily extras will be on chapter 5, then we'll wrap up the following Monday again with the short quiz. And then likewise the same the following week, leading into midterm 2 for chapter 6. So I think you guys probably have all seen chapter 4 is pretty complicated. Chapter 5 is as well. So I mean the material is going to quickly pick up steam here. So I think we really need to pick up that efficiency with reading, solving problems, applying information. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 actually have a relatively short set of concepts within them, but a wide range of problems we can solve with those. And hopefully we're picking up those ideas and those abilities through the work we're doing in the class. Okay, so to wrap up, to calculate your homework score, just look up your total earned points, divide by 198 right now through problem set 10. If you want to figure this out some other point in the semester, just go through and see how many points were available in the pre-lectures and the problem sets, add them up, and then that's the total that you need to earn for that 100% grade. And then just be aware that you should use the Mastering gradebook, not the Carmen gradebook here. There's some errors right now in the Carmen gradebook. Now, another quick little mention is the Carmen gradebook, for a lot of you guys, is probably how you're navigating to the actual assignments. So the Carmen gradebook has some functions beyond the actual score appearing there. So it helps you see a listing and the assignment listing in your calendar view and all those great things. So there's some benefits to having these assignments in Carmen, even though we can't quite figure out how to get the scores to appear correctly. But at the very end of the semester, I just download all the scores off Mastering, total them up, do the math like I'm saying here, set the max scores to 100, and then I read those into Carmen. So the actual setting of your grade in Carmen is done completely manually by me downloading a score report and doing a bunch of Excel work in Excel to get those scores into Carmen. Okay, so let's talk a moment about your lecture score. So, to check your lecture score, you can go to Top Hat. Carmen is not live updated. Generally speaking, Carmen's live updated with the Mastering scores with, sometimes a lag of 30 minutes to an hour with your score updating, but Top Hat doesn't do that. So Top Hat isn't updating every time you complete an assignment. Every so often we go and actually push an update. It's kind of complicated, it takes a while. But your score is best seen if you just go over to Top Hat and check and see your total score. It should be a number of points. So look for your point score, not your percentage. The reason why is you're earning 1.25 points per question. We've asked 60 questions, it turns out, so far. That means there's 75 points that you could have earned. If you look at your percentage score in Top Hat, it'll list your percentage of those 75 points that you've earned. But now, the only points you have to actually earn are 1 point per question, and only for the content questions that I've asked week 2 and beyond. What that means is week 1 was all bonus. So everything I asked week 1 was pure bonus points or extra credit points. The survey questions I ask from time to time is extra credit. Then every time you're right and you get that 1.25 points on the question, instead of just you get half a point for trying, 3/4 of a point for being right on each problem on the content. And so that means every time you're right, you're getting a small little 0.25 point bonus. Now I've asked 48 content questions. So there have been 48 content questions from week 2 and beyond so far through this past lecture yesterday. And so that gives us a total of 48 points that you actually have to earn. So the total points that you've earned, you would take that score here and divide that by 48 and then times 100% to get your lecture score. And what this means is that if you just go into Top Hat and look at your score there where it doesn't know this math, I got to do this afterwards at the end of the class with like an Excel spreadsheet again, just like with Mastering, that if you have a 64%, then you really have 100% in terms of the way your grade will actually be determined at the end of the semester. So right now, 64% and up really has a 100% grade. And if you have like a 63, then you probably have, 96% or something like that. And so now this percentage is going to creep up a little bit because we had, something like 10 questions given during the first week as a bonus. We're going to, that's going to become a smaller percentage of your grade. So, the target here is probably about 70 to 75% at the end of the semester will be about the total you need to get to for that 100% grade. But like I said, every time you're right on a question, you get a small bonus. Okay, so now the way I would use lecture points, or just the idea of these problems in lecture, is it's a chance for you to be engaged with the material. It's a chance for you to, like in soccer practice these days, back in the old days, maybe, I played sports, you would just get into a line, you kick the ball once, and then you'd go back, get in line again, and then do it again like 3 minutes later. Now, if you guys played soccer when you were growing up, you probably had all these things called no-line drills. A no-line drill is where you have all the kids kicking kind of constantly. You have everybody doing something and doing a drill throughout practice, so you're not waiting and spending, 90% of your time watching other kids kick the ball. You're spending 100% of your time now kicking the ball around. You learn a lot faster that way. Same idea here in lecture. It doesn't do me any good to kick the ball around and just show you, oh, hey, go figure, I can solve a problem. I think, that might be a fine use of time. It would certainly make you impressed with my problem-solving ability. But I'd rather see your guys' problem-solving ability and collaboration abilities to work with each other to solve problems. I think the best way to interpret your lecture score is if you're a leader in lecture and you're the one helping other people solve the problems, then you're probably doing pretty well in the class. And if you're not the leader in your group, if you can become the leader, then I think your grade will show an improvement. So I think watch lecture videos before class, read through as much as you can, just get ready for the content, and just build from what you know is the best way, I think, to be that leader. And whether you're a leader or not, you're probably going to get, just a fine lecture score. If you just come to class every day and participate and try, you're probably going to get 100%. So I don't want anybody's grades to be bad from us giving you guys a chance to kick the ball around to show us that you can solve some problems and work together. But like I said, just try to step up, try to be that leader, try to show others how to solve problems, and I think that'll pay off in the end on your exam scores. Okay, so the last major thing to talk about is like how you actually calculate your grade versus how Carmen does it. Now, the way Carmen does it is this. If you have a recitation grade, which we all probably do, it takes that as 5% of your grade, because that's 5% of the class. We haven't talked much about recitation here today, but you get your 2 lowest scores dropped. I imagine most people are getting mostly perfects on these things as long as you're going and trying. And maybe occasionally you get below a perfect score, but you can have up to 2 absences for any reason. Those are automatically dropped. So whatever your 2 lowest scores happen to be, if they're zeros, they're dropped. If there are some relatively low scores, they would be dropped. And so then your highest 12 of 14 recitation scores are counted towards your final grade. Now, your homework score is 7.5% of your grade. The, let's see what else we have. Lecture is 5%. Lab, 20%. Midterm 1, 10%. 2 is 12.5%. Midterm 3, 15%, and the final is 25%. Now this total here is 52.5% that we haven't yet had in the class. So these are only scores that you might have ongoing, and some of these aren't even like technically entered into Carmen in a way that it's calculating those grades into your final. Like homework is weird because of some issues with Carmen, so we actually have that kind of turned off to calculating into your final grade. So if you want to calculate homework into your grade, you have to do this by yourself. And the same thing with lecture. Since the score that's reading into Carmen is really just your top hat score, not your corrected grade based on the grade scheme, we can't have that total into your final either because that would make your score look wrong than what it is. So right now, the only grades actually factoring into your score on Carmen are probably the recitation score, lab, and midterm 1. Now, what this is doing, or what Carmen's doing, is saying, okay, if you have like a 95% in recitation, it's doing, a 0.95, let's say, times 5%. If you have a 85% lab score, it's doing 0.85 times 20. And if you have, say, 80% on the midterm, it's doing 0.8 times 10%. Then it's adding all those up and then dividing by 5 plus 20 plus 10. So it's dividing by 35. So it's just taking your earned points and dividing by 35% and then calculating your total earned points of that 35% of the class. Now, this isn't really the best way to calculate your score per se because midterm 1 is now factoring in as if it's only about a third of your grade, when exams are actually more like almost 2/3 of your grade. Exams account overall for 62.5% of your grade. Okay, so how can you calculate your exam score in this class by hand? Or what's the easiest way to do this? Well, what I would do is take your recitation score times 5%. Whoops, why did I do that? So take your recitation score times 5%. Take your homework score and do this as a fraction. So just do 0.95, whatever your recitation score is, or 1 times 5%. If it's 100%. Do your homework score times 7.5%. Do your lecture score times 5%. Do your lab score times 20%. And then take your midterm 1 score, whatever your score was on midterm 1, say it's an 80%. But whatever your score is, put it in here, and then multiply that by 62.5. Okay, because this is basically going to say, well, if you continue averaging the same score on all the midterms, then that'll give you a score in the class where the exams are appropriately weighted, so that your exam score, if it's a little bit lower than your others, will kind of appropriately, in the same weighting, impact your final grade. So if you add all these up, then you should get a score that is, somewhere between a 0 and 100, but it'll give you maybe a better idea of where your score happens to lie on an absolute scale, kind of weighting the exams a little bit more. Now, what this is going to do, if your score on the midterm is relatively on the low side, is it's going to show your grade is relatively low. I think you need to see that if that's the case, so that the goal is getting that score up from midterm 2, midterm 3, and the finals, so that we're adding in a higher score on these exams. And then it's also not overly inflating our grade and thinking that it's better than where it is right now because of these other components, which we have scores on, and could be, like if you just look in Carmen, are going to be like overinflating your grade from where it might be at the end of the semester. So you can calculate your grade by hand. Probably easier to do it this way than just looking at your score in Carmen. Okay, so how do you improve your performance on midterm 2? I think you just have to find the right ways for you to really learn how to solve the problems the first time you see them. And for everybody, that could be a little bit different, but I think doing some skimming before you get too deep into a topic, do a detailed read at some point. For most people, I think this detailed read is probably after lecture on a particular topic. So if you're reading sections 5.1 to 5.5 today, that might be a great idea. Watch the lecture videos. Watch them more than once. Slow them down, speed them up, rewatch certain parts. Take the pre-lecture videos, watch them multiple times if you need to. Incorporate some of that watching of the videos with actually going through into the book. So go to the textbook, look for those shaded box examples, the sample and practice exercises. These practice exercises, there's 2 for every sample problem. There's a sample problem, and each chapter has about 10 or 15 of them, and it shows a worked out solution to the problem. And then it gives you 2 practice exercises. One's multiple choice. Those are all fed into Mastering Chemistry somewhere, and a lot of those end up as like daily extra assignments. Some of them end up as quiz problems on the pre-lecture assignments. But one of the other practice exercises, along with every sample exercise in the book, is a short answer question. These are all answered in the end pages. So look in the end pages. They have the answers to these short answer practice exercises, making those some really good problems to review the material. You can form study groups with your friends. That's a great way as you get close to a midterm to go over some of the practice exams. And lastly, try to focus on your learning. Whatever's confusing you, try to figure out what that is and learn more about that particular topic, and then build on what you understand. So try to approach problems as a building from where it is that you are in the class and what you currently understand. Okay, so lastly today, what I want to do is do a quick projection of where grades might end up at the end of the semester. So again, we have recitation, homework, lecture, lab, midterm 1, and then midterm 2, midterm 3, and the final. So let's just say the other exams. Okay, so the value in the class here, recitation, 5%, homework, 7.5, lecture 5, lab 20, midterm 1, 10, other exams 52.5. And so then the typical average on these assignments. Recitation's usually about 90%. Same with the homework. Same with lecture. Now again, you're actually giving points up if you don't get 100 on these, and it's very possible. But that's typically where those averages end up. Labs usually about 80 to 85, call it 85%. Midterm 1, we saw 76%. And then the other exams, let's say they're about 70%. They get a little bit trickier, content's a little bit harder, comes at you pretty fast. So not too surprising that the scores may drop from where we're at now. Okay, so if you propagate all this up and you add all of these, typical averages up, what that means is that we're shooting towards an average probably of about 75 to 78% overall in the class. So in other words, unless the exam averages are much, much lower than where we're projecting, I wouldn't worry about a curve. I mean, I think if you want a good grade, you got to get in this range here. If you want an A or an A minus, you just got to find yourself in this range here. And if we end up rounding a little bit up from the 89% range, that's great. But I mean, if you really want to make sure you get an A, we just got to find a way for your score to get into that 90% and up range. The last thing is sometimes get the question of, is it possible that we could curve down? And, the simplest way to answer that question is we don't even think about where you may think the grade cuts should be when we cut our grades. So like if the average ends up being like an 81%, like let's say the actual average here ends up being like an 81 at the end of the semester. And the issue will be that the performance in the class is probably going to be strong enough to dictate that we curve the class to a higher grade if that's in fact the case. But if for some reason that's not the case, it has happened occasionally where maybe the 81% gets a C plus and you expect it a B minus. The only thing I can say is that the goal that I have in this class is trying to make as many resources available to students so that you can find your grade into that highest possible grade range that you can get into. And the more students that we get there, then the better overall our chances are at getting a better curve grade than a C plus. So, if the average is going to be a C plus, then only half the class is getting a C plus or better by definition. If our performance is better and we can see that difference, we can prove that to the vice chair of undergraduate studies of the department, and we get a curve around the class to say a B minus instead, then half the class is getting a B minus or better. That's slightly better than if our exams were just like harder and our averages were lower. So there's this like weird thing that if our exam averages were lower, there'd be a bigger curve, but fewer people would be getting better grades. I want more people to get better grades. I want more resources to be available to have students do better in the class, not worse. And if we get more students doing better, we should be able to see that. We should be able to note that. We should be able to get a better overall average grade in the class. But let's say it's an 81 and we can only get a B minus. That's still better than if it's a 78 and we curve to a C plus. At the end of the day, if your grade's an 80 and you get a C plus, the real issue is if the resources weren't available, the average would have been a 76 and you got a 75, you probably would have gotten a C. Okay, so it's really hard to describe, but the major message here should be getting your score in the highest range possible and how you get there. And I think the way you get there is through efficiency with that reading, efficiency through watching lecture videos, and getting really good at solving problems the very first time you see them so that you have the best chance of getting the highest possible score on midterms. Okay, so I hope this information helps. Like I said, it's probably slightly confusing. I mean, it would be in a way nice if we had a grade scale that we could point to, but the challenge here is that every one of the Chem 1210 classes does something different with their homeworks and their recitations, and every class has a slightly different average just because of some of the variables in each of the classes that aren't the same. And I think this is a good thing. I think it's good to have each of our classes have their instructors do things that they think are best for their students. And in the end, we just have to have a consistent way of setting grades in all of our classes so that, like I give more points away in recitation than some other classes. So we can't necessarily have more people get a better grade in our class compared to some other class, or maybe they just had like a quiz or something a little bit harder in terms of the grading and their recitation. So we have to have a way of setting grades in the class such that there's fairness among all the different Chem 1210 sections, so that no matter whose class you take, that on average the students are getting a very similar type of grade for a very similar type of ultimate exam performance in the end. Okay, so that's all for this video. A little bit longer than I probably thought this would have been, but I hope this is some good information for you guys to think about and really just focus on improving those scores, getting closer to that 90 to 100% range, and building on where it is you are right now in the course.